heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
Hello, welcome back to Louis Sinclair Investigates the Dodleston Mysteries. We're coming to the end now of our investigation. We've followed the story, we've looked closely at the messages and their curious mixture of rubbish and sophistication, that IQ testing game that 2109 appeared to be playing with its manipulated messages. We've weighed up the possibility of hoaxes, either from Ken, Debbie and Peter, or from paranormal entities. And now let's put all those pieces together, along with a few other rather intriguing revelations, and see that full picture. Our final questions are: was 2109 running some kind of experiment with time manipulation, and getting Lucas in the past and Ken in the present to report back on it in their books? An experiment that appeared to be going wrong. And was 2109 reaching out to us for some special purpose, a purpose that is hidden in plain sight in that cipher, that conundrum, that until now no one else seems to have cracked? So let's turn our attention first to that experiment. 2109 had talked about tachyons, those hypothesized faster-than-light particles that, if the conditions are right, could transport matter across time. So are we actually witnessing an experiment with time? If so, we could dismiss any ideas that we might have that Lucas and his friends were just spirits of the deceased, engaged in some kind of electronic séance, but were, synchronously, in their time as alive as Ken, Debbie and Peter were in theirs, which would explain how 2109, through its experiment, had been able to warn them in that very first message about Lucas's eventual arrest and the sheriff's, or pussycat's, need to go to London to save him. A warning at the very beginning of the connection, months before the arrest and Lucas's release actually happened. 2109, the clairvoyant, seeing clearly through the whole of time. And this experiment was obviously really important to 2109, who was concerned that if they continued to
disrupt our experiments,
the conservation of reality could be threatened. How could this be? Dave Welch and John Bucknell from SPR had said, back in July 85, that our traditional view of time, a continuum like a horizontal arrow, was incorrect, that time is actually vertical, with all times layered in a vertical plane. In a sense, all times happening at the same time, but experienced or perceived by us humans as changing minute by minute. Indeed, Albert Einstein himself had said,
"The distinction between the past, present and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion."
That we live in an ever-changing now, which only feels linear because we humans experience the universe through our linear thought processes. But of course, that is how things are meant to be. And with 2109 introducing vertical time to humans, who are supposed only to exist and operate in horizontal time, the collective had actually endangered reality. We humans are simply not meant to experience vertical time directly. It's the ultimate irony, because 2109 had warned Ken and the others that
knowledge will be your progress, but your kind are coming close to getting their fingers burnt.
In other words, we humans don't have the wisdom to use our advancing knowledge safely. And that's exactly what 2109 was doing. With its advancing knowledge, the experiment with time, the collective was actually reaching too high, getting its fingers burnt, and it simply didn't have the wisdom to realise that the experiment posed an enormous danger to reality. An experiment using new technology that was unreliable and difficult to control.
We are not entirely in command of this experiment,
as 2109 had admitted, and indicated when Lucas had once complained that there was, as he said, little power, so that he, or 2109 through Lucas, couldn't communicate. Indeed, according to 2109, its experiment was so fragile that even by their finding out Lucas's real name, everything that Ken, Debbie and Peter had experienced could disappear from reality. And as part of the experiment, although the collective had wanted Ken and the others to connect with Lucas, it now realised that by their getting too involved, things were going wrong. From silence, a storm was approaching, a storm triggered by humans changing the past, as Ken and the others had done when they'd manipulated the sheriff into saving Lucas's life by threatening to damn his soul forever if he didn't release Lucas. Or getting others involved, as they had with SPR. Both of these actions threatening the stability of true time, vertical time, undermining it, destabilizing it by altering it. As you know, when we talk about time travel, the problem of the grandfather paradox always comes up. That if by the actions of a time traveller their grandfather had never met their grandmother, then they themselves would not have existed to have gone back in time. And 2109, in its arrogant foolhardiness, had unleashed this paradox, turning it into an existential threat. Hubris leading to nemesis, overestimating one's abilities, leading to negative consequences. Perhaps to preserve reality, Lucas was actually meant to die. Indeed, the collective had started to panic when it saw things were going wrong. In a very extreme reaction, it had smashed the disk drive to prevent them communicating, and said that it needed to let things cool down. So 2109 wasn't as wise as it thought, and had brought on the storm itself by mistaking its knowledge for wisdom, the very thing that it accuses us humans of doing. And it wasn't just humans destabilizing the time matrix.
It is correct for you to assume that the poltergeist phenomena is present in the communications.
2109 had said that the poltergeist shouldn't have been there, set free in time to mess around in the present and the past. Indeed, Dave Welsh from SPR had suggested this. Paranormal entities moving at will between the layers, or even existing synchronously through all of them, and thereby, more ominously, influencing and potentially destabilizing reality. Had the poltergeist sneaked into the time conflation by some kind of metaphysical osmosis? Rather like with AM radio, you can be listening to a program, and other wavelengths, other radio broadcasts can creep in.
A worm is covered from top to toe with a sort of slimy substance, but not only that.
And 2109's lack of control of the experiment is shown when it said that it could only try to do something about the poltergeists, unsure of how to stop or get rid of them, and becoming more and more alarmed. And this is when I'd like to return, as promised, to the entity One. One tends to get a very bad press. I've read or watched just about every review of the Dodleston mysteries. 2109 always comes out as basically the good guy, and One's often painted as the baddie, the interfering troublemaker. But in the same way that I've shown 2109 to be far from perfect, because we now have the full picture, we can see that One, despite his faults, was genuinely trying to alert Ken and his friends to the dangers. He said that 2109 was actually messing around with something dangerous and uncontrollable, unleashing forces that could potentially destabilize reality, and had warned them to avoid any further involvement. He even said to Lucas that he'd brought those troubles on himself by getting involved. It's even possible that, as 2109 had suggested, Nick Sowerby Johnson may actually have been a projection, an embodiment of one, desperately trying to persuade them here on Earth to shut down their involvement with 2109 and thereby safeguard reality. No wonder that 2109 wanted one out of the way. As we've probably all experienced in our lives, arrogant folk don't like to be proved wrong. So in a way, by seeing the full picture, not just the pieces, we've spotted a reversal of how 2109 and 1 are usually thought of. But just to clarify, I'm not saying that 2109 is a baddie, not at all. Just rather human in a way, a mix of qualities and not always following his own good advice. Anyway, before I draw my final conclusions, I'd just like to mention something seemingly inconsequential. The colour green. An important and significant colour throughout human history. Green was sacred to the ancient Egyptians, who often painted their temple floors green. This belief spread to Persia, where green was, and still is, seen as a sacred colour. And more relevant to our investigation, green is seen by mystics as a bridge builder between everyday reality and the unseen world, the paranormal. And on that subject, you'll recall that when 2109 was explaining the subject of time, it said that when a UFO crosses an area of convectual magnetism, a green mist forms around the vessel as the extraterrestrial occupant is transported across time and space. Indeed, the colour green keeps coming up in the story when there's any indication of time manipulation or a paranormal connection bridging our world with something metaphysical. So, when Debbie saw Lucas in the living room with her, he'd appeared from a white light that turned an incandescent green. And Lucas had said that he'd been visited by a very arrogant man called One, a time traveller whose shadow glowed an incandescent green. And later, when Lucas was about to receive the computer from 2109, he'd seen a green light coming from the walls of his chimney before the entity had stepped out from it. I saw a green light issuing from the walls of my chimney, and from this light stepped what I thought was the devil himself. And is it just a coincidence that their BBC Micro had a monochrome green monitor, the very focus of all these goings-on? Well, it's certainly a thought. So is a green glow or mist known to be associated with time distortions? Certainly Steve Meara thinks so.
In my research, I've come across many examples of a green glow, which are often associated with paranormal phenomena.
And it was this phenomenon that first attracted me to the Dodleston mysteries. As a young chap in the mid-80s, I'd felt a curious impulse to visit the house where I'd lived as a child. Looking up at the door of my old bedroom at the top of the stairs, I felt strangely drawn towards it. And, as I ascended, I remembered how the bedroom used to be, with my favourite bed cover and its distinctive astronomy design, and a Leonardo da Vinci helicopter poster on one of the walls. But as I approached, my heart started to pound. Why was I so nervous? Slowly I opened the door. The new owners had converted my old bedroom into a home office, complete with an Apple Mac Plus, the main rival to the BBC Micro. Then gradually the room began to glow green. A mist swirled round, and through it I saw my old bedroom, exactly as it used to be. And then the past passed, and the room returned to the present. And although I didn't know it then, this was at exactly the same time as only about 10 miles away, Ken, Debbie and Peter were having similar experiences, particularly Debbie, when she was visited by Lucas. Coincidence? Or possibly it was some kind of time distortion leak, a distortion spillage, as it were, associated with the unstable experiment. Anyway, the frequent references to the colour green would seem to support the notion of time being manipulated by 2109. So what do we make of this mystery in Dodleston and the strange goings-on there, in the past, the present and possibly the future? Are the bits of the puzzle forming a full and clear picture? Actually, I think we have, in the words of 2109, two choices. Either paranormal entities, poltergeists perhaps, just messing around, though the story does feel too complex and sustained for that. According to Colin Wilson and Steve Meara, poltergeists have notoriously short attention spans before they go off to find their next easy victims. Or the other possibility, an entity, paranormal or extraterrestrial, possibly a genetically or AI-enhanced humanoid from the future, or indeed existing outside of time. An entity that's running a very early and very unstable experiment with time manipulation, with the BBC Micro Model B computer acting as a bridge between the paranormal and the physical worlds. Personally, after having studied Ken's book intensely for over a year, I feel it's more likely to be that. And for me, that's underlined by the way that SPR and the ufologist Gary Rowe backed off. Was what was actually going on far too hot to handle? Indicated by the way that, according to Ken's account, SPR had lied to the Chester Observer newspaper about their questions not being answered, when originally they'd said that they had been partially answered. And if Nick, supposedly a member of the Society for Psychical Research, was actually a manifestation of one, as suggested by 2109, that might explain why SPR had said that they'd never heard of him. I'll finish now with something relevant to us. In a way, I think, at the very heart of the Dodleston mysteries. 2109 may not have been as wise as it thought, but its motive was noble. It said that, through the experiment, it was offering guidance to the modern world through those communications with Ken, Debbie and Peter. What guidance? Well, first, that there is a difference between human knowledge and human wisdom, warning us that we are advancing, particularly in science, but not always wisely.
It is better to have no knowledge at all than to have a distorted view of the truth because of your lack of understanding.
Think of the genius Albert Einstein, who encouraged the development of a device, as it were, to end conflict, and later saying, "Woe is me," regretting his lack of wisdom about the horrors he'd naively brought to an unstable world. And second, "I think if your government does take and use my strange device for themselves, then it would become their play box. It is essential that your government does not take our computer." Warnings through Lucas about the danger of governments using computers to control their people. Something that's actually happening today. Whether using artificial intelligence for genetic manipulation, creating enhanced humans, but just for the rich and powerful, of course, or developing sniffer bioweapons that can target individuals thanks to the accelerating collection of personalized DNA readings, or surveillance using cell or mobile phone tracking and the like, including using surveillance for the prediction of potential criminal behavior. Public CCTV, for example, is being digitized to track criminals using AI-driven facial recognition and with wide public support. But would the public be quite so happy to know that it also tracks other citizens, you and me, who innocently and inadvertently interact with those criminals, as in this clip, perhaps simply by asking them for directions, and then marked as persons of interest, possible associates of criminals? And where do the authorities find most of these photos for facial recognition? Social media, where people willingly give them all the information they want, a treasure trove to be plundered and used for the public benefit, keeping a big brotherly eye on all of us, keeping us safe. All of these are warnings that really we should heed. And maybe that's why 2109 had said that Ken, Debbie and Peter
have a purpose that shall, in your lifetime, change the face of history.
Have a purpose, writing the book to warn us. And that, as 2109 concluded,
Knowledge will be your progress, but your kind are coming close to getting their fingers burnt. Indirectly, you may prevent this. Get out your bricks. Get ready to build. Write the book.
So now we know what "get out your bricks" actually meant in that very first message. Not Lucas saying, "Get out of my stolen house," but 2109 saying, "Ken, help to build a better future. Write the book, spread the message." And who was this message for? Through Lucas, 2109 had already started testing Ken, Debbie and Peter to see how perceptive they were. You'll recall that Lucas supposedly had asked why they hadn't spotted his errors. Think of it as 2109 asking them through Lucas. Were they going to be bright enough to heed its warnings? A paranormal IQ test for Homo sapiens sapiens. Or is 2109 using Ken's all-important book to test whether its readers are bright enough to heed the collective's warnings? We know the collective had the power to alter text coming from Lucas, text that was, frankly, linguistic rubbish, sprinkled with tantalizing tidbits of sophistication. Did the collective want it in the book to see if any of us spotted it? And did it think that, with the challenges humanity faces, such perceptive people would be the very ones to try and sort out these problems, and thus rescue the world and humanity from a potentially perilous future? Was the collective fishing for the likes of you and me to offer us this guidance? And now a few extra and rather curious thoughts about 2109.
You said your time is 1985. I thought you were also from 2109, like your friend who did bring the box of lights.
Initially, Lucas had led us to believe that 2109 was an entity from the year 2109. But as the story progressed, this seemed not to be the case. And, as we found out, the collective's name wasn't actually 2109.
How can we have a name?
So what's the significance of that number? In his account, Ken wonders if the number 2109 is actually a cipher, a secret code of some sort. And I think he's right. First, if we add up the individual numbers of 2109, we get 12. And, as I'm sure you know, the number 12 has great significance, mystical significance, in many ancient human cultures, and is often associated with guidance, salvation, and hope for the future. So, as regards 2109, let's investigate any such indication of guidance and salvation by referring to ancient Middle Eastern writings, namely the Bible, and then to Mayan and Native American prophecies. First, the Bible. And there are nearly 200 references to the number 12 in the Old and New Testaments, most obviously Jesus' 12 disciples, and, of significance to our investigation, the 12 tribes of Israel. Because, if we multiply 12 by itself, we get 144, which is seen as an even more powerful number than 12 itself, as here in the New Testament book of Revelation, where 144,000, that's 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, would receive salvation, indicated by a seal of God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. So we may have uncovered a possible numerological indication of 2109 being the bringer of salvation, hope for the future through guidance. In other words, confirming the conclusion we've already come to. Now let's see how that relates to the ancient cultures of the Americas, where we might also find out who 2109 actually was. In addition to the concept of theosophy and angel numbers, it relates to Mayan and Native American prophecies. That 144,000 enlightened masters, as a collective, will communicate with us one day, with the number 144 signifying their mission. which is to encourage humanity to embrace reason and wisdom, and thus liberate it from a dark and manipulated future imposed by those obsessed with controlling us. And the purpose of this prophesied collective? To reach out to us with guidance. And regardless of whether one believes in such prophecies or not, Ken conveying a collective's guidance does appear to be the intended meaning of the cipher 2109. And with that, we've come to the end of our investigation. The pieces of the jigsaw puzzle have come together. The characters from the past and present, and the reasons why they were chosen by the entity from possibly the future. The messages with their strange but revealing mixture of rubbish and sophistication, and the unstable time experiment. And all these pieces now assembled into a full and illuminating picture. The vertical plane appears not to be a hoax by Ken Webster, Debbie Oakes and Peter Trinder. Rather, it carries a message that's important, particularly to our present times, advising us, indeed warning us, to resist making existential mistakes that could threaten our future, the future of humanity. Now, of course, these are just my thoughts. You may have spotted clues that I've missed, and if so, or if you have any other ideas, please do leave comments down below. I'd be delighted to read them. Actually, we could produce some follow-up investigations based on them. And I'll put a link to Ken's excellent book in the description. Though I have revealed the full picture, the main storyline and its meaning, there are some curious subplots that are certainly entertaining, including ones about Lucas's possible girlfriend, Catherine. Anyway, thank you sincerely for watching. I do hope you found this unusual story as intriguing as I did, and that you enjoyed our bit of detective work. And if you did, would you kindly do 2 little clicks, like and subscribe, and share with like-minded friends. Doing that encourages YouTube's supercomputer algorithms to recommend these videos. That's us humans controlling artificial intelligence for a change. And of course, subscribing will alert you to new investigations about the curious world in which we live. Anyway, I hope that in the future, or perhaps in the past, we'll meet again for another Louis Sinclair Investigates. Thank you again. And, as they said in the Middle Ages, farewell. I hope you fare well. Cheerio.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.